Hello, everybody. We are live. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm just going to stall for like 15 seconds. We're just waiting for this feed to feed out to YouTube, which takes 15 or 20 seconds. And then I'm going to introduce our speakers. I will start by thanking Verso and Between the Lines for hosting this event. And just want to remind everybody that you can buy everybody's books at the buy button at the bottom of your screen where it says buy the panelists' books here. That is a link to Bookshop. Bookshop is a new e-commerce site that supports independent booksellers. So 30% of all of your sales through Bookshop will support independent bookstores. So this is a teach-in on the impacts that COVID-19 and disaster capitalism has had on debates around democratic planning and public control of utilities and transit. So I'm going to introduce your speakers and just want to let you know that you can post questions in the chat on the right-hand side. You can pose them as a question, and then there's an Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen where you can vote on which questions you're most interested in. So please make use of that feature. Let's see what else. Oh, this is being recorded. It's going to be archived on Verso's YouTube channel, so you can go back and watch this later. And also just want to let you know that Verso Books is having a big sale right now for the month of May. All of our books are 50% off and our ebooks are 80% off. So go check that out. So I'll just start by posing a few questions that the speakers will then comment on in their opening remarks. And then we'll have a more specific discussion around planning and transit and public power, and then we'll open it up to questions. So this event kind of got going with a few prompts from all of the speakers today. Those questions include things like, what opportunities does the recovery from this pandemic present for each of the themes that we're discussing today? So public power and democratic planning and mass transit. And how can activists pressure leaders and mobilize mass movements to prepare for the next crisis? And how can we push for the same urgency in the response to climate disaster? And is this crisis making the case for democratic planning of the economy? So those are a few things that all the speakers will be addressing. So we're going to start off with Michal Rozworski. Michal is a union researcher and writer. He publishes frequently on political economy, and he's the author of The People's Republic of Walmart, How the World's Biggest Corporations Are Laying the Foundation for Socialism, which you can buy right now for 50% off at Verso. Okay, Michal, take it away.
Okay, so I think for the opening part, I'll try to talk about that last question. So basically, is the crisis making the case for democratic planning of the economy? Oh, I think my video just left. Sorry about that. And I think I have a sort of two-part answer. I think the crisis is making the case for planning, or helping to make a bit more of a case for planning, but I think it's definitely up to us to make that a case for democratic planning, or a planning that serves the rest of us. I want to start maybe with an example. And about a decade ago, or at least what feels like a decade ago, in early April 2020, the Canadian government was looking to distribute its national stockpiles of PPE to hospitals and health authorities and other agencies across the country. And it needed a sort of solid logistics network that could carry out, a planned sort of efficient distribution across this entire vast country. So what did Justin Trudeau do? He called up Jeff Bezos and contracted Amazon to do this for him, for the federal government to do this national distribution. So I think this shows, this basically helps answer that question. It shows two things. I think it shows partly just how sort of badly the sort of even the nominally democratic public sector that we have, where we vote every 4 years, even that has been so badly hollowed out by neoliberalism and austerity, captured by the private sector, and how reticence or the government is to use its own tools, including the unionized workforce at Canada Post, to do this kind of work and to empower them to do this kind of work. I do think, on the other hand, that this contract shows something that we tried to bring out in the book, is it does show the sort of logistical and planning capacity of Amazon, that economic planning is all around us, that it's hidden within the four walls of the corporation, that it's, based on worker exploitation, a lot of harm to communities, all sorts of irrationalities, but that Amazon's logistical network can solve these thorny problems of distribution allocation, but in a way that is fundamentally undemocratic and basically anti-democratic. What Jeff Bezos says goes at Amazon. I believe we call him the bald, mustache-less Stalin of online retail, and I think that's accurate. So I think that illustrates sort of that twofold thing where we definitely have seen an increase in planning and as part of the response to the crisis, but it's definitely been very anti-democratic. I think what the crisis has also shown, and I think what people I think it's sort of become more of a general something that people are picking up on, is it's showing very clearly that human needs and private profit do not always align, and that we can't count on the market to produce or distribute things in a way that secures basic human needs, health, food, shelter, all the basics that are so necessary at this time, so viscerally necessary, always necessary, but especially at this time. So we've seen just how under-resourced our healthcare systems are, how basic healthcare research into vaccines and other treatments isn't done if the profits are too small, or if it's too unlikely, how the dangers of work are so unequally distributed, and how that access to fundamental necessities like food and shelter is so precarious in the richest societies in the history of the world. And we have seen governments, try to solve some of these issues with a marked increase in state intervention and planning. So we've seen, the payrolls of a significant chunk of private companies basically effectively nationalized in a bunch of the global north. I think, the US in many ways is an outlier in this and is doing very poorly. Some are doing a bit better. No one's doing that great. There's factories that are retooling under government orders. Louis Vuitton in France is making hand sanitizers instead of perfume. Tractor maker John Deere is making face shields. There's lots of examples. We've seen that, a new round of quantitative easing. Spain has nationalized hospitals. New York State has taken sort of, the patchwork network of private healthcare and private hospitals, and basically turned it into a de facto statewide system, at least for the duration of this crisis, just to try to, manage things, just to do sort of emergency management. I think one of the most striking things for me was seeing Donald Trump invoke the Defense Production Act, this sort of Korean War era piece of legislation to get GM to produce ventilators at a shuttered factory in Ohio. But of course, at the same time, just last week, we saw him again use it to order meatpacking workers essentially back to work into some of the biggest coronavirus hotspots in the United States. These factories that are literally killing workers when they're at work, and putting their whole communities in danger, and workforces that are largely Black and brown, migrant, and some of the lowest paid, relatively low paid and relatively hard work. So we've seen this sort of dance of kind of contraction on, this sort of lockdown contraction, target expansion, partly planned, just because I think it's, even the capitalist states of the world, even some large corporations, recognize that left to its own devices, the profit motive would basically not pause for a pandemic, right? And in fact, if anything, we've seen that the scrambles, at the same time we've seen some of this planning, the scrambles for PPE, the difficulty in food supply chains, all these other things point to a big lack of resiliency, of genuine planning on the part of our economies. on the other hand, I think we shouldn't get too carried away. That everything is not different. This is basically, I think disaster capitalism is a good word. I'd add that might be a kind of sort of disaster statism, right? This kind of planning is a disaster statism that's basically a stopgap to allow things to return to quote unquote normal and as usual. It's a large part of it is losses being sort of socialized. And we've already seen billionaires like Jeff Bezos add huge amounts to his billions, and he's not the only one. So that's kind of what's happening on the big front. If I have a couple more minutes, I wanted to just raise one other thing, and I think at the same time as that's been happening, sort of at the state level, at the level of big corporations, and all of that, at the same time, we've seen sort of new wellsprings of collective action emerge all around us. Mutual aid groups are showing clearly that people are ready to collectively plan to satisfy basic needs, even if it's just within the limits of what they can do with their neighbors. All over the world, people are taking this physical distancing stuff very seriously, even at large sort of economic cost to themselves and their loved ones, often their lives becoming more precarious, ready to shift their lives in a big way to reach a collective goal. So I think there's this focus on sort of basic human needs, on human needs overall, that we can't allow to be forgotten. While at the same time, I think it shows also that mutual aid is clearly not enough. And that's not said in a way to attack it. It's just that we live in very complex societies that are so interdependent, not just nationally, but also on a global level. And I think the pandemic is also, viscerally showing that, that we can't avoid or escape these questions sort of, and they're hard questions of large scale planning, both in production and distribution, and democracy, and all the way up to that global level. So I think what we need to start thinking about, and just to sort of answer that question, what we need to start doing just to start to answer that question, is about how we harness this wave of mutual aid and the attention to human need, these sort of glimpses of alternative in the midst of a broken system. I think there's two big questions: how will we build the institutions that bring about a more democratic economy, and how will we build the institutions of that democratic economy themselves? And they're huge questions, and they'll be crucial in the years to come, really. And I think these are some of the things that we sort of raise in the book, and I think they're starting debated more. Rationing, retooling, renationalizing production, all of these things are explicit signs that the market has failed. But the questions of the alternative, how do we ensure that the right goods and services get to the right people? How do we distribute inputs into production up and down supply chains? How do we divide, our economic capacity amongst the huge diversity of human needs? Who does what, and who gets a say in each of these questions? In short, what does democratizing the economy look like in practice? I think these are huge questions, and how we can utilize some of the new technologies, existing systems that are making private planning more successful, but to its own end. So how do we transform a lot of the tools that we have? I think there's some small. I'll end with one. I wanted to squeeze in one more example before I finish. One more from the sort of frozen northern tundra of Canada that might not have made the news everywhere around the world. So about a year and a half ago, General Motors announced that it would be closing its car assembly plant outside in Oshawa, which is just outside Toronto, and laying off the 2,500 roughly workers left there, down from a peak of tens of thousands before NAFTA. And since then, it's been really great to see a coalition of workers, community members, and others come around and organize something called Green Jobs Oshawa, that's been campaigning to have the plant retooled to build electric vehicles in transit for the public sector. So when the pandemic struck, Green Jobs Ottawa used this opportunity and quickly raised the demand that the plant be retooled for necessary medical production, whatever that would be. And it's partly under this pressure that the Canadian government did announce that it reached a deal with GM to make 1 million masks a month at the facility, sold at cost to the government, and putting 50 of those 2,500 or 2,600 workers back to work. I mean, while that's a far cry from the demands of Green Jobs Oshawa, I think it's a start, and it points to the possibility, of turning the useful things that capital throws away simply because they're no longer profitable, into something socially useful and socially necessary, and especially in a way that comes from the workers, from the communities themselves. I think, it's a seed of a vision for a more democratic post-crisis reconstruction where we would actually see things like this, rather than losses being socialized while we wait for a return to normal. You could see failing enterprises being not just bailed out, but turned over to workers or to the public sector, transferring ownership and control to workers, giving some initial expertise, and allowing an actual democratization and transformation of facilities in the same way that you could see, rather than governments handing out rent subsidies, as they're doing in British Columbia, directly to landlords, using that money to start to buy stakes in rental buildings and actually transfer them to cooperative or public ownership in the same way, and actually affect some of that transformation rather than just that sort of holding pattern to get back to normal. But that'll be up to us to see which exit we take. I'll end with that. Sorry, that was a bit long.
Great. Thank you so much, Michal. So up next is Thea Riofrancos. So Thea Riofrancos is an assistant professor of political science at Providence College and the author of Resource Radicals. Her writing has appeared in The Guardian, N+1, The Boston Review, Jacobin, Dissent, and In These Times. She serves on the steering committee of DSA's Eco-Socialist Working Group, and she's the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, which is on sale at Verso for 50% off. Sorry, I'm going to keep saying it. And you can also buy it on Bookshop, which supports independent booksellers. Either way, it's a great book. Thea, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Can everyone hear me? Yes? Awesome. So I'm gonna I love Michal's introductory comments, and they were wonderful. And I'm gonna sort of echo a few things that he said, but hopefully give a different angle on them, or sort of put them in a slightly different perspective to not be redundant with my co-panelists. I think the broadest thing that I would say right now about the crisis that we're in, and we're in a set of intersecting crises, right? So we obviously have a global health crisis. We also have a economic recession or depression, depending, which forecast you believe, that's worsening by the day. And then of course we have the climate crisis, which is ongoing, unfolding, and is also a crisis that is episodic in terms of like particular moments where it's particularly bad. And we're about to enter into wildfire season and into hurricane season, right? And so sort of just, if you want to feel apocalyptic, put yourself in a sort of space of thinking about what would it be like for emergency responders to deal with like a wildfire like we had last year in California right now, like given what state capacity is like in the US, given that our, basically our capacities are tapped, and also given social distancing protocol, how do we evacuate people from a wildfire? How do we evacuate people from Hurricane Maria or Irma? And those hurricanes, that level of extreme weather events is going to recur. And in fact, scientists are predicting a particularly bad wildfire and hurricane season. So these are going to intersect, right? So there's a lot happening at once. And we also know, and Michal already sort of pointed to this a bit, and this won't be new to anyone probably tuning in, but we know that people based on class, race, gender, geography are very differentially affected by crisis, right? And so it's a lot of the same communities, the same workers, the same regions of the world that bear the brunt of one of these crises are bearing the brunt, are going to bear the brunt of all of them. And that is a very scary situation in terms of the human and the natural toll. So that's those are the kind of broad, that's the broad outlines of the crises that we find ourselves in. But what crises do, and I think, again, I'm sort of echoing some of the prior comments, they don't create new problems. They kind of exacerbate, accelerate, existing dynamics and contradictions in global capitalism. And so to sort of turn to the economic crisis of the three that I mentioned, right now around the world, we definitely see this playing out in the US, in Europe, and in Latin America, some of the places that I personally pay the most attention to in terms of the news, but it's happening everywhere in the world, that the private sector, that private accumulation is increasingly reliant on government support, right? In order for the basic motor of capitalism to move forward, like the government and the state need to step in and need to help recover the economy and then sort of reactivate the engine of growth. I would say that was like a pre-existing condition that we've been in. I don't know, it depends on, which variant of Marxism you subscribe to, but we've been in it for several decades now, right? You could say capitalism always relies on the state. And at a fundamental level, that's obviously true just to the basics of protecting private property. But there are moments in capitalism where that deep dependency on the state and specifically on forms of public investment becomes more salient. And we were already in one of those moments for, this kind of past couple decades of so-called secular stagnation and just declining levels of growth and productive investment. But now with an extreme economic crisis, it's just abundantly clear that capitalists themselves cannot survive without public investment, right? So all this crap about the free market or laissez-faire or those are sort of, we could get into whether that was ever true or that was ever really what neoliberalism was about, but certainly not now. Certainly they are asking for state help and forms of, welfare, we might call it, right? But that dynamic was already happening before. What we're confronting is that it's sped up a lot, and now we're getting lots of bailouts, from the EU, from the U.S. Congress. We're seeing corporations be bailed out. At the same time, again, an ongoing contradiction and dynamic, but one that has been sped up by the COVID-induced economic recession, is that people are struggling to survive, right? So ordinary people, workers, communities. Just the fact that our basic condition of existence is commodified, that we have to sell our labor for a wage in the market, and that we purchase all of the basics of survival, from rent to utilities to internet to clothing, whatever it is, we purchase them on the market, right? That basic commodification of existence is revealing itself to be, it put masses of people in an extremely precarious situation, right? That was already the case. We already had deep economic precarity, inequality, super exploitation prior to this COVID-induced recession. But now all of a sudden, I don't know what the numbers are today, but 30 million jobless claims. And that's of course an underestimate, because there are many people that don't apply for unemployment insurance that actually should use it or should be able to benefit from it. So we have millions and millions and millions of people just in the US that are unable to survive without income support from the state. So on the one hand, just to summarize, on the one hand, you have capitalists basically asking the state to help them. And you have entire sectors like the fossil fuel sector, which we will talk about more later in response to some other questions. But the fossil fuel sector literally can't exist without subsidies. That was the case before. It's even more the case now with negative oil prices. So we have the capitalist private sort of economy in general wants state help, particular sectors unable to exist without state help. And then on the other side of that class relationship, we have masses of ordinary people that can't survive via the sort of normal, let's say, market mechanisms of selling their labor and buying things on the market to eat and to have a home and whatnot. So we're seeing both from the side of capital and from the side of labor that the state, and particularly the state sort of public investment arms, are terrains of class conflict, right? So whether the state and specifically the state's investment capacity will be used to bolster private accumulation, will be used to bolster the profits of the rich, or whether it will be used to bolster their survival, and hopefully more than survival, the thriving of workers and communities, is the key question right now. So as socialists, and Marxists, and whatever our specific kind of political identity is, I think what we should be thinking about is the state as a really key arena of class conflict. And that does not is not to say that the workplace is not also an arena of class conflict, that neighborhoods aren't arenas of class conflict, or that the home is not also arena. Like, there are many arenas of class conflict, but there are certain historical moments in which the sort of the state apparatus becomes, I think, particularly salient as a domain of struggle. So that's kind of one big piece that I want to put out there. And then I'm just going to say a couple of more things, one about tactics, and then I'm going to zoom out to the sort of global level. And I was so glad that Michal already brought up mutual aid, because I was going to say on the more hopeful end, like, I've talked a lot about crisis, I've mentioned the word apocalypse, like, this doesn't per se sound like a pretty picture. And we know that, if capital and labor are confronting one another on the terrain of the state, this kind of politically mediated class conflict, we know that, like, capital has like a big advantage there, right? Like a structural advantage, not just it's the normal advantage that they have of like the deep inequality between capital and labor in the workplace, but the specific political alliances and political resources and political networks that they are privy to are, masses of ordinary people are excluded from those types of those avenues of political access, right? So that to say that the state is a domain of class conflict is not per se a hopeful statement. It's just like, I'm just trying to be a realist about where I think a lot of the action will be. But what I think is hopeful is some of the things that were brought up in the earlier comments, which is that, it's amazing to me that, despite how much people are so focused on their immediate needs, very understandably right now, despite the fact that people are struggling to survive, whether for economic reasons or whether for health reasons, and despite the fact that social distancing really limits a lot of the key tactics that the left and that workers and communities rely on. Like, when you are on the left and when you are, coming from the grassroots and from the working class, like, much of our power is about our numbers, right? It's like literally about like the density and numbers of the fact that we're like on the side that has more people. Like, they have the money, they have like the political power, but we have the masses. And like, a lot of our tactics sort of emanate from that, flow from that, like the occupation of public space, right? The ability to do a mass work stoppage or picket line. Like, a lot of these depend on us being physically proximate, because that's how we demonstrate our true power. Our leverage kind of emanates from that. So, despite the fact that a lot of those typical left tactics are limited right now, people have been doing amazing things. So there's like still labor strikes happening. And what's so cool about them, there's a lot of interesting things. And I think particularly with Michal's work and also with James's work in terms of the specific types of workers that have gone on strike, I think it's really interesting. We can talk about supply chains and transit and warehouses and all that kind of stuff. But one thing that I'll just point out is that even with fewer workers, in fact, in some cases dramatically fewer workers than a sort of traditional strike, engaging in the strike activity in person, in terms of the workers that show up to hold up a banner. And then, of course, there are many more that on social media sort of participate in one way or another. Despite the fact that fewer workers are able to participate, their actions are having like sort of escalated impact. And I think that just speaks to like the fact that it speaks to how essential their labor is, right? So like, even with fewer workers engaging in the stoppage, you can shut down supply chains, and those choke points become like very visible, I think, as points of worker leverage. So that's inspiring to me. That all the Amazon and grocery store and et cetera workers going on strike. Also the rent strike stuff, I mean, we could get into more later perhaps, but on May Day, there was massive coordinated rent strikes across the US. And just if you look at those maps of how many people participated, if you wanna get into a good mood, I recommend doing that. And then there's utility bill strikes. I'll talk about those more later in terms of a DSA campaign that focuses on utility ratepayers going on strike by not paying their utility bills. And then there's the mutual aid kind of neighborhood, sort of territorialized networks that Michal already mentioned. There's interesting creative ways of sort of repurposing public space, even though we can't physically gather. So right outside, I'm in my home right now, and behind me, there's a banner outside my house that says like people over profit or people not profit. Anyway, so lots of people doing banner jobs. That's really cool. Like, okay, we can't be out on the street en masse, but we can definitely still make use of public space and visibility. So I think that, despite like the deep asymmetry of that politically mediated class conflict that I referred to earlier, we do have a lot of creative tactics being deployed. And I absolutely absolutely think that they're having an impact, both on capitalist accumulation and on supply chains and sort of using those choke points, but also politically. The more progressive members of Congress and at the local level as well are really picking up movement demands, and the people's bailout framing resonated a lot. So I think that there is a moment of, crises are openings, and there is some more receptivity of some more, previously seemingly very radical demands. So I'm just going to end with one other quick set of comments. I'm not sure if I've gone too much over my time. I apologize if I have, but just want to mention one thing, which I think also resonates with some things that Michal already said, which is about, how much the crisis or those set of crises that I mentioned are revealing how vulnerable global supply chains are. Like, for decades, we have had this so-called free trade regime, total misnomer, really. It's like actually a hyper-regulated system. But the point is that, one feature of that sort of neoliberal or neoclassical, quote unquote, free trade regime is that production is very globally dispersed, and like each stage of production happens in like different places, and there's all this like computer technology and transportation technology that allows it to sort of come together into a final product and then be consumed at the end. And it turns out that system, while there is some economic logic to it, I mean, from a capitalist perspective, is actually extremely vulnerable against in terms of financial shocks, climate shocks, public health, recessions, all of that kind of stuff. So I think that, one other benefit maybe potentially, depending how the left sort of takes advantage of it, is that it's the current global order is like obviously like not sustainable, and the basic way that global production is organized, especially when we think about things like medical supplies. Michal already talked about that, but I'll just add, like, when we also think about things like green technology, which I also view as like life-saving technology, right? If we think about solar panels or wind turbines or electric vehicles, like those are also produced by these very complicated, globally dispersed supply chains that are just as vulnerable to these types of shocks as the medical supply chains are. And, it raises all these interesting questions, and I'm just going to say the questions. I'm not going to answer them right now because that's what our whole conversation is about. But like, what would a more resilient kind of global organization of supply chains look like? What would a more democratic organization of those supply chains look like? What is like a real left alternative to either neoliberal globalization or right-wing isolationism, neither of which I see as viable strategies for getting the life-saving technology that all of us need? And how can that technology be more equitably distributed around the globe instead of what we have now, which is a rather oligopolistic sort of control over who gets technology and who can afford it? So I'll end there. Yeah, fascinating questions. Thanks, Anne.
Okay, great. Next up, I will introduce James Wilt. James is a freelance journalist and graduate student based in Winnipeg. He frequently contributes to leftist Canadian publications, including Canadian Dimension, Briarpatch, and Passage. He's the author of the recently published book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Cars? Public Transit in the Age of Google, Uber, and Elon Musk. And you can buy that at Between the Lines Publishing. Okay, James, take it away.
Great, thanks so much. You can hear me okay? Yeah, okay, perfect. Yeah, so I'm going to talk real briefly about the impacts of COVID-19 on public transit specifically, and also talk about some opportunities that are emerging and what it's going to take to kind of take advantage of those. I'm not going to like spend a ton of time on this because it would be good to get to some of the questions, but I'll just give a brief overview. So the impacts of COVID-19 on transit have been absolutely catastrophic. I was just looking at the intro of my book, and I was talking about how between 2014 and 2017, transit ridership in the US fell by 6%, which I described as startling, which it is. Like there was great reason for concern at that time, but COVID has resulted in a 90% drop in ridership in most places. The San Francisco Bay Area Transit Service, BART, has experienced a 94% reduction in ridership. It's estimated that transit agencies in California alone will lose $2 billion in fare revenue and additional operating expenses. And so the federal relief package, which is worth $25 billion for transit, is not expected to get through the summer for these transit agencies. So that's very worrisome, obviously. But then there's the catastrophic impacts on the workers themselves. 83 transit workers for the MTA in New York have died as a result of COVID-19, and another 3,500 workers have been diagnosed. At least 28 bus drivers in London, UK have died, and 37 transportation workers in total. And it's, of course, not only drivers, it's mechanics, maintenance workers, cleaners. In New Orleans, there's been no additional paid sick leave for drivers. There's been a very harsh attendance policy implemented. And because transit workers are disproportionately older than the general population, they're not only susceptible because of the kind of work that they do, but also because of the demographics. So it's really catastrophic in a number of ways. And of course, municipalities and regions have responded mostly by cutting transit. So that means issuing pretty mass layoffs and also cutting transit service itself. And so this, of course, disproportionately harms the people who need reliable transportation the most. So healthcare workers, long-term care facility workers, grocery store clerks, warehouse stockers, all the essential workers who we know are already earning very, very little money for what they're doing. And a survey which was done by the New York City Riders Alliance found that 2/3 of respondents felt the crisis had forced them to choose between their health and financial security. So this is having just massive impacts across the board, which I'm sure anyone who has had to ride transit during this crisis is well aware of. And so we have to turn to what the opportunities are for recovery from this pandemic when we look at transit. And my argument is, as with every sector, it clarifies what we've known for a long time about transit funding and planning. The CDC, but also ATU and transit unions across the continent have made very clear recommendations about what's required to keep workers and riders safe on transit. So that means, implementing measures to actually allow for social distancing. So actually closing off sections of the bus or the train, or making sure that only certain seats are used. Asking riders to enter and exit the bus through the rear entry. More frequent service to reduce overcrowding, and abolishing of fares to enable rear door boarding and PPE equipment for every operator. All the things that are needed at this very moment are very clear. More cleaning, better pay, additional training, all these sorts of things. And what we've seen is, once again, transit agencies have been forced to solicit funding from a very erratic combination of revenue sources. So traditionally, they've had to charge fares, obviously. So every individual that boards the bus or the train is required to pay a fare, but also through sales taxes and government transfers, which have long limited the ability for transit to improve in the way that it actually needs to compete with private automobiles. And this ultimately shows that it cannot and should not be funded as a private service. It needs to be funded and planned as a public service in a truly democratic way. So in response, we've seen fares temporarily abolished in many cities around the world, including London, UK. That was only implemented after 20 transit workers died. And this, of course, follows other cities that have motioned to make this permanent before COVID. So that includes Kansas City and Dunkirk, France, and a number of other cities around the world, mostly in Europe. But this represents an opportunity to permanently transfer the spending responsibilities for transit from the rider and other individual sources to state, provincial, and federal governments that are in a far better financial position to actually fund operating costs. We've also seen, as Thea mentioned, work stoppages and other job actions by transit workers, which have been effective. So there's a one-day work stoppage in Detroit that led to more frequent cleanings, better PPE, use of portable washrooms. There's been multiple work stoppages in Toronto with TTC workers, including a dozen mechanics refusing to go out on their evening shift after a cleaner was diagnosed with COVID. And then transit workers have been organizing across the continent. And it's really their power and their organizing that we have to express solidarity with. But ultimately, it also means recognizing how closely linked struggles for improved transit service are with many other struggles. So this includes, climate justice, the defense and expansion of public housing, including rent moratoriums and anti-eviction measures, and a very radical redistribution of wealth that allows for people to shelter in place when needed in situations like this, which is a situation that's only going to become considerably more dire in the near future with climate catastrophe. And then, of course, there's the question, okay, how can our societies prepare for this happening, again, especially facing down climate crisis, which, Thea gave that very apocalyptic scenario looking forward. As if we've needed any more proof, and this is something Michal talked about, is that this is an incredibly clear demonstration of the fact that the pursuit of private profits greatly undermines and destroys efforts to protect human lives and well-being. So in Alberta, which is the province where I was raised, just today, a meatpacking plant owned by Cargill that's responsible for the largest COVID outbreak in Canada reopened today. So the plant relies on migrant labor and is basically issuing death sentences to workers in order to benefit the Cargill family, which has a total of 14 billionaires within the family ranks itself, which makes it the largest single collection of billionaires within a family. Or we can look at Elon Musk's behavior on Twitter recently, calling for an end to the lockdown, tweeting out the lyrics to Star Spangled Banner. Him as a personality is very bizarre and worth criticizing in itself. But I think ultimately it shows that private companies and CEOs have absolutely no interest in guaranteeing the safety of their workers or of people in society in general. So the answer, which I think we'll get more into throughout this teach-in, is it's much stronger public services. So it's not only transit, but housing and energy production and distribution and food and healthcare. And in the specific case of transit, we need much more consistent funding for transit operations and capital projects, which means having to take resources from the rich. And we really have to start building cities, towns, regions to prepare for the devastation that's going to come from climate change, which means climate-proofing infrastructure. And providing, these important lifeways for people in climate change, worsened flooding and other situations to escape. But it also means fighting for the decommodification of transportation and housing and food and healthcare. And many incredible authors, and including others in this panel, have detailed that. Seeing the interconnections with there's a supposed crisis of unhoused people using buses as a public space in Edmonton, Alberta, for example. The union local there has kind of flipped its position on free transit because of this. There's a whole complicated discussion around public safety, especially of the workers themselves. But what we need to be looking at this as is a intersection of many different crises. So housing, harm reduction, all these sorts of things, and ultimately necessitates the abolition of fares and the abolition of policing and securitization of transit, which is very disproportionately impacts Indigenous people, Black people, other people of color. And it means fiercely resisting the privatization efforts of transit, as well as the incursion of next generation automobiles like ride-hailing services, personal electric vehicles, and autonomous vehicles. So that's a lot to throw out at once, but hopefully it just kind of gives an overarching sense of where things are at in the transit landscape. Things are very dire, and I'm personally under no illusions that things are going to get radically better unless we, as has been expressed by other panelists, really organize alongside transit workers and the transit riders who are most vulnerable. So the essential workers who are forced to continue to go to work in these sorts of situations, making sure that they have transit service which is genuinely safe for them, which is affordable if not free, and gets them where they need to go in a very efficient manner. So that's all I'll say for now.
Okay, great. I just have a few questions for the panelists, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. So I'm going to start with a question for Michal. So there have been major state interventions in countries around the world responding to the fallout from COVID-19, such as Spain nationalizing its private hospitals and Trump invoking the Defense Production Act to produce medical equipment. What do you make of these kinds of interventions? How do they or don't they represent what a socialist transition may look like? And then I'll just add one more question on top of that, and you can kind of fold them in together. Does the need for transformation of the economy in light of future crises, such as another pandemic or responding to a climate disaster, does that alter the case for planning? Or does that make the case stronger or weaker?
Two great big questions, and thanks James and Thea for those great presentations. There's so much I was trying to take notes and find things to respond to there too, but I'll try to keep it short. I mean, I think I tried to touch a bit on the Defense Production Act and some of the other those policies like Spain nationalizing its hospitals. We've seen, as I said, clothing makers making hospital gowns, people like 3D printing face shields in factories small to large. I think there's going to be apparently another big executive order use of the Defense Production Act coming from Trump sometime this week on sort of renationalizing some production in the US, specifically medical, and be interesting to hear Thea's take on, I think, energy system components and things necessary for utility and energy systems. I mean, yeah, I think, these are as much a transition to socialism or to a different economy in many ways as the Pentagon being a publicly funded structure and department of the state. Maybe that's putting it a bit too far, but I think these things definitely at this point fall under the rubric of a scramble to produce what we need under the exact same conditions that existed before, and in a way that still basically utilizes the whole machinery of sort of private enterprise. There's been a reluctance to put even minimal conditions on the bailouts that have been announced. A lot of the bailouts up to this point have been, a lot of it has been to just get income into workers' pockets, which is important. Whether in Canada, it's things like, speaking on the Canadian example, we have a sort of benefit that's not like a basic income, but just a sort of, a broader kind of welfare benefit that's made to go to as many people as possible who are losing work because of this. And then we've seen these wage subsidies, which theoretically is something that in a sort of short-term harsh crisis, something that capitalism should be doing, just putting money in people's pockets so that they can spend in that, in like next week I have to buy groceries or do whatever. But even the minimal condition of this wage subsidy money has to be used for wage subsidies is not there. Never mind things like we might take equity stakes if we have to, bail you out again, or you can't be registered. You can't be registered in a tax haven. Very sparsely used. You shouldn't be paying dividends. You shouldn't be buying your own, doing stock buybacks within the next year. You should limit CEO compensation. You should put some workers on your corporate board. This was a great opportunity to at least put some of these, what I would call very, very minimal conditions on private enterprise, just to show that things are being done slightly differently. And none of those, essentially almost none of those have been done, except for small examples here or there. So I think there's not that much, other than, again, just I think the really useful thing is reiterating and showing people just how much, as Thea put it well, just how much capitalism needs the state, and especially in the crisis, needs it to step in and prop up the system, and how much there is an aspect of sort of conscious direction that can easily enter into things as soon as there are problems. And I think, again, it's a bit of our task to show that this is not, again, as Thea said, something that's that out of the ordinary, but something that's happening in the background quite regularly. I mean, in terms of that second question, very briefly, I think the answer is yes. I think a big crisis actually makes, and it, not even as much a big crisis as a crisis that demands sort of transformation of the productive and redistributive machinery of the economy, is one that makes the case for planning stronger. There was a great set of papers, sort of public reports, that came out from the Roosevelt Institute within the last, I think, month or so, authored by J.W. Mason, an economist at New York City, who I think we probably all at least know, and I think Thea, I see nodding her head, and that's he's done a lot of work on the Green New Deal, and Andrew Bossie, his co-author. And it was a couple papers looking at the mobilization during World War II, specifically in the U.S. context, which a lot of people have brought up as, somehow in some ways similar to this crisis. I think, again, a lot of people have said, there's an important aspect of demobilization in response to this pandemic, but there has been a mobilization of specifically some of these sectors, like medical production and things like that. The lessons that they draw from World War II mobilization are precisely that, a rapid transition actually requires a larger role for public investment. A rapid and more thoroughgoing, the quicker and more thoroughgoing transition you need, even within the system we have, the larger the role for public sector investment. The public sector is good at getting new industries going. An example they point to is something like synthetic rubber during World War II, which was basically almost inexistent to, went from inexistent to a huge industry in the span of a few years. I think that's an example for the Green New Deal. There's tons of industries that we basically don't have or have, are in their infancy that that need that kind of push, and that the public sector can provide in a deep crisis, and in a crisis, where again you need some sort of really big transformative capacity, can provide that space, can show that the economy can do a lot more than we normally think. That things are a lot more elastic than we conventionally assume, especially when you have the public sector backstopping some of this stuff. And there's a third lesson that they draw that isn't as much related to, to this question of whether a transformation, a big crisis makes a better case for sort of planning, but I think is important, maybe even in answering the question of how we push on things more, is that what you saw during World War II, during this sort of public sector led, partly transformative in terms of sort of what was being produced and how transformative sort of program, is you saw basically full employment and wage compression. I think, full employment in the current situation will look very different than what it looked like during the war, especially in the age of physical distancing. But you actually saw, without explicit redistributive policy, a big compression of wages, and especially wages of those at the bottom of the distribution growing much faster than those at the top. And that giving, I think, a lot of political space for a lot of the movements that came out of the post-war era, especially, and the trade union movement and things like that, where you just have basically an emboldened working class. And that's partly, a result of a public-led sort of transformative program. Again, even if, as during World War II, it's still largely within the confines of an existing system. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, great. I have one more follow-up question for Thea. There has been a celebration in some sections of the internet about the rapid drop in power consumption and greenhouse gas emissions due to the fallout from COVID-19. An example is that electricity-related emissions in Europe are down 39% from the year prior. At the same time, the drop in emissions forecast for this year seems to be below that annually necessary to keep global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius, although that depends on the scale of the recovery. So I guess the question is just what has this crisis told us about power consumption in a capitalist society, and how can that inform a just transition and a Green New Deal strategy?
Great. Great set of questions that I feel like I've been spending all week trying to get my head, well, not all week, it's Monday. Who knows what time it is anymore, but like the past several days, I've been trying to get my head around this because it's sort of the drop in emissions due to sort of the economic contraction has reopened a lot of debates over degrowth and green growth. And I'm not going to actually enter into all of those debates and their specificities, but I kind of want to lay out a little bit what has happened as a result of the contraction, but also mostly what hasn't happened and what could get worse if we don't do something more transformative. So as Anne just said, we have had this sort of record drop in emissions globally, and it stands out in particular regions of the world more than others, particularly the regions that have entered into sort of a deep lockdown and quarantine have seen major reductions in emissions. They're not enough in terms of the 10-year plan to cut carbon emissions in half that the IPCC laid out for us a couple of years ago. So they're not enough to get to that goal, but they're still record breaking. So I think it's important to sort of note the scale of the emissions reductions. Relatedly, but I'll just analytically separate it. We also have the entire fossil fuel industry in this totally catastrophic crisis for them, which is good for us, though it does, again, how that plays out, as I sort of referenced before, it could play out in a number of ways, including major bailouts for the industry that we've already seen, not only in the US, we're seeing them in in Canada as well. We're seeing them in a lot of places, and even in South Korea, despite their recent Green New Deal, there's been bailouts for the coal industry. So, we're definitely seeing that governments are lending a helping hand to the industry, but it is an industry in crisis, which is both good for the environment, and the fact that it's slowing down drilling, slowing down fracking, and therefore, reducing emissions of various greenhouse gases, first and foremost carbon, but also methane, and also other very dangerous greenhouse gases. But it's also politically weakening the sector to some extent, though again, we see that those alliances with politicians are bearing fruit. So that's kind of where we're at with the emissions scene. And now I'm going to sort of transition to why this isn't enough. So it turns out that just like a major economic contraction in which lots of people not only aren't traveling long distances, aren't commuting shorter distances, and also are not consuming as much because of the fact that they have less income to work with. Despite all of that, the economic lockdown is not going to put us on a path on its own. Is not going to put us on a path to the types of emissions reductions that we need to meet the Paris Accord goals or the IPCC report goals or any sort of the major goals in terms of decarbonization. And why is that? So now I'm going to get into the sort of bad news. The bad news is that, as soon as air travel becomes, people are still flying, but as soon as air travel becomes more like okay for many more affluent people to engage in, they will engage in it, barring other policy measures that prohibit that. So air travel is likely to recover rather quickly, I think, after the social distancing limitations are loosened. Passenger car travel. So James outlined this, and it's really staggering, the statistics, but we also, and I think that he's very aware of this and points to this, but I just want to reiterate the politics of travel, which are the politics of transit, which are that the private car manufacturers are going to make the argument that private individual automobility is much safer for public health than mass transit, right? They're going to say that if you get on a bus, you'll be infected, right? And they're going to just use this argument even after COVID is a distant memory decades from now. They will use this argument as long as they can to say that it's actually safer for public health to be an individual passenger vehicle. So that's another thing. And for now, what that means is individual internal combustion engine vehicles. It means that because we have not adopted electric vehicles on a mass scale. And this is, of course, putting aside all the critiques that James and I know share about Teslas as a solution to climate change. But of course, electric vehicles are better than ICE vehicles in terms of emissions. And so the fact that we're not at a stage of electrification where that's been massively adopted means that when people use cars instead of transit, they're using cars that are very polluting, right? So that's concerning. There's also the fact that the petrochemical sector is booming right now for a few different reasons. So petrochemicals are everything that's made from oil that isn't gasoline or diesel or the fuel goes into petrochemicals. And petrochemicals aren't everything we use. I may not need to explain this to this audience, but all of our plastic stuff, lots of stuff that we use that's all around you and on your body is made with petrochemical feedstock. And petrochemicals are this amazing saving grace for the fossil fuel industry, because at moments where oil or diesel or gasoline have lower demand for whatever reasons, they turn to petrochemicals as a profitability strategy, because it's just it's an endless source of potential demand for them to sort of these petrochemical feedstock for the manufactured goods that we all use. And they are going to make the argument that, for example, single-use plastics, which are something that a lot of localities and states around the world were starting to ban because they're so bad for the environment. Not only do they generate lots of waste and garbage, but they also emit over their whole life cycle. A piece of plastic actually still emits even after it's produced. So now the petrochemical and plastics industry is going to argue that without single-use plastics, we can't have sanitary conditions. And so it's better for us to just use stuff that we throw away that's disposable because it's more sanitary, right? So they're going to make that argument. And so that's just going to be another thing that, again, barring public measures that counteract that, could actually increase emissions. And then there's just generalized thing that happens often with economic recoveries because of some of the reasons I laid out, but also because of more general dynamics that oftentimes in economic recoveries, you have this big spike in emissions, right? And they're called sometimes retaliatory emissions. I mean, there's different ways of analyzing, what they are and why they happen, but they do tend to happen under a regime of generalized fossil fuel consumption. And so again, that even though we have this reduction in emissions, which is of course not a reduction in the accumulated emissions in the atmosphere, which is increasing by the day, but it's reducing the rate of that increase, right? So we do have that important reduction in the rate of increasing atmospheric emissions. We have no reason to think that will continue to be the case once economic recovery happens. And we actually have every reason to think that these super polluting industries have a lot of specific arguments that they're going to make to try to get us even more hooked on fossil fuels, petrochemicals, private cars, all sorts of things. In addition, I want to make another just overall point, and then I'll get into the more positive stuff in a moment, or the more optimistic, what we should be fighting for piece, which is going to resonate a bit with arguments in James's book and with things that he already said, which is just the way in which this kind of public health, the specific kind of public health crisis makes arguments that we have on the left that have already been stated today for collective consumption more difficult. It makes it a little harder to say we should all be together consuming things together, whether it's social housing, mass transit, sort of public luxury, being in free art and theater and museum exhibits together, all of those types of things that left public policies like to encourage because they're good for equality, they're good for public and civil life, they're good for worker power, they're good for a real sense of leisure that's real leisure and not sort of the fake consumer leisure that we have under capitalism. So, all of those things that we like to promote involves forms of social proximity. And even though those are not the cause of the crisis at all, and it's a totally fake right-wing talking point that it's cities are where this spreads because people live too close together. That's not the real reason. And in fact, COVID is increasing way faster in rural counties than it is in urban counties. And why is that? Because rural counties don't have enough hospitals. The reason for crisis is because we don't have social care, not because we live close together. But they are going to use those arguments, and it's going to make it a little more difficult. It might be easier to argue for democratic planning of the economy, but it might be hard, as Michal was just saying, but it might be harder to argue that we should live in dense places and collectively consume things together. So we're going to have to just think about how to rebut those arguments because they're not empirically true, but they're ideologically very powerful. And so that's the bad side of the ledger. I think what the positive take-home message is and the inspiring message is that, lockdown, economic lockdown and quarantine is not a decarbonization strategy, right? It's just not. What is a decarbonization strategy is a Green New Deal, is green stimulus, is democratic planning, is social care, and collective provisioning of what we need to survive and thrive. And I think those are real policy and movement responses to the crisis that offer real alternatives that we should absolutely fight for, because the necessity of those approaches is actually being proven for us in real time, because all of the reasons that this crisis is so bad is because we don't have those things, right? And so I think we absolutely can and should make those arguments. And I think just the most important thing for the left right now is not to feel intimidated by the right-wing talking points or by the reality of immediate crisis, to not be intimidated by those things in terms of making really bold demands. And something that I've been working on with some other people in the US is this sort of green stimulus approach. I co-authored, and I'll drop it in the chat later, an approach that basically takes the core idea of the Green New Deal, which is that we need rapid decarbonization, we need public investment in frontline communities, we need to increase equality, we need to provide people with options like mass transit and social housing. Those core ideas of the Green New Deal, and applying them to the economic recovery. What would it look like for our economic recovery to put us on a path towards social equality and decarbonization, rather than doubling down on fossil fuels, financialization, widespread precarity, which is the way we recovered from the quote unquote recovered and didn't recover from the 2008 crisis, right? The way we recovered from the 2008 crisis made every single feature of racial capitalism worse, right? It increased the racial wealth gap, it made people more precarious, it increased the role of finance in our everyday lives and in our economy. So now that the left is honestly in a much better place in the US at least, and in some other parts of the world than it was in 2008, we need to like be ready to like offer our own proposals for economic recovery specifically, and emphasizing a green and socially just recovery, I think, is the way to sort of bring the Green New Deal into the present moment. So I'll drop that in the chat and my comments there.
Thanks, Thea. That was great. Okay, one more question for James. And let's see. So Thea talked about this briefly, but James, can you talk a little bit more about how we deal with the fact that there might be more of a turn towards increased car use as this pandemic eases, with people reasonably being afraid to use public transit? And on the other hand, how can we use the experience that people have just had of living in relatively car-free cities and towns? And what does this open up in terms of campaigning and policy? So for example, cities like Milan and London, and I know we've talked about it in New York too, are converting some of their car lanes to bike and pedestrian infrastructure. So can you talk about those two things?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very important point, because there are like very legitimate reasons why people may not want to use transit at this moment. We've seen photos on Twitter of very extreme overcrowding, both in stations and on trains and buses. People not wearing PPE, drivers not having PPE, all these sorts of things. So there's very real fear for this, and the weaponization of this crisis that Thea mentioned is consistent with basically the entire history of transportation politics in North America in terms of the classism and the racism against transit users. I'm just going to read a quote from Elon Musk in 2017. Some may be familiar with it, but I think it's good to reiterate. He said to a conference, "I think public transport is painful. It sucks. Why do you want to get on something with a lot of other people that doesn't leave where you want it to leave, doesn't start where you want it to start, doesn't end where you want it to end, and it doesn't go all the time? It's a pain in the ass. That's why everyone doesn't like it. And there's like a bunch of random strangers, one of whom might be a serial killer. Okay, great. And so that's why people like individualized transport that goes where you want, when you want." And of course, the implication that there's serial killers on transit and such is really reprehensible. But I think what he's tapping into is a very common anxiety and set of anxieties that people have in terms of their ability to rely on transit to get where they need to go, the ability to get there in a somewhat affordable way, all these sorts of things. So my argument is that the only response is to make transit far better, far safer, far more accessible for everyone involved. So that means we need far higher frequency and reliability of transit service, as well as far greater accessibility for people with disabilities and seniors. And in turn, that means a massive investment in adjacent infrastructure. So we're not only talking about buses and trains, although of course we're talking about those things. We're talking about public washrooms. We're talking about harm reduction sites. We're talking about benches and shelters with heating and air conditioning for the winters and the summers, power wheelchair charging stations, all these sorts of things. So what that means is listening to the demands of workers and riders who are the most vulnerable to not only COVID-19 transmission, other public health impacts, but just very bad transit service in the best of times. So in the context of Winnipeg, which is where I live in Canada, the city just unleashed a series of very debilitating cuts on transit service. So that includes the laying off of 250 full-time and part-time drivers. But even before that, its budget proceedings ended a highly successful free shuttle that had connected the city's downtown core near to where the North End is, which is a community that's overwhelmingly Indigenous and people living in poverty. So I think the first thing that we have to acknowledge is that people's experiences of transit in the best of times can often be very poor. And so that's a reason why when a crisis like this comes up, the first inclination is to think, okay, well, automobility or ride hailing or autonomous vehicles are the way to go. And that's because, as others have mentioned, there's a dominant ideology of the automobile in its association with freedom and safety, the freedom where you want to go, when you want to go, and the freedom from not being on overcrowded buses that don't have climate control. So you're overheating, you're paying a user fee that you're reminded of every single time you use it. And so most of us know that the claims that automobile manufacturers and fossil fuel companies make to freedom and safety are a fiction. That's why, you only ever see car commercials with the vehicles on a dirt road or a downtown which has absolutely no other vehicles or pedestrians. But it's a discourse that's become absolutely hegemonic in our society, which justifies the continual expansion of road infrastructure to supposedly reduce congestion despite everything that we know about induced demand. And that's, why the tens of thousands of people who die every single year in car crashes are largely dismissed as, accidents or tragedies or whatever word we want to use, is that, there's this conception that it's in exchange for freedom or safety. So the response to this can't be to dismiss those desires for freedom or safety, although it should be noted that the latter is often, associated with very racist stereotypes that have to be confronted, whereas, comfort often gets conflated with safety, which can justify all kind of carceral responses. But the overall point is that we need to make a case for other modes of transportation providing freedom and safety. It's not going to be identical to the experience of getting in your, Tesla or getting in any kind of automobile and going where you need to go. But there is an ability to replicate that and to reduce the number of trips that people have to take, and all these sorts of things. So, it's been a real joy to be able to walk up and down previously closed roads in Winnipeg. And the roads that were selected for closure in Winnipeg are in overwhelmingly white and affluent neighborhoods, not in the areas of the city which are lived in by Indigenous and Black residents. But the road closures that have happened mean that families can, they can walk, they can bike, they can scoot, they can skateboard, all without fear of getting hit. But this also has to be, it's not enough just to look at that and to say, okay, this experience people have had walking, biking, it's great. It doesn't escalate into the kind of demands that we need. It has to be partnered with demands for fair, free, and high quality transit. So Paul Mees, who's an Australian transit planner, argued that, and this is a quote from him, unless public transport is so convenient that it offers real competition to the car, then schemes to promote walking and cycling and to restrain car use will founder. And so in terms of messaging, we need to be really emphatic about the fact that a return to private automobile use undermines every other kind of transportation. There's Jarrett Walker, who's a transit planner, often talks about the geometry of transit and, just transportation in a city. And he says that there's just simply not enough square footage of space in a city for everyone to have a private automobile, which remains true regardless of what the motor is or the engine is that's actually powering the vehicle. And we also know that as a fact that Indigenous and Black pedestrians are much more likely to get killed by cars. Wheelchair users are much more likely to be killed by cars. So the exchange that people have in terms of, having this freedom or the safety through this private automobile is coming at the cost of other pedestrians and other transport modes, including buses. The number one thing that is creating inefficiencies in bus planning and transit planning is other automobiles on the road. We're constantly seeing pictures of, cars crashing into the TTC streetcars, or, Uber and Lyft vehicles will pull over into bike lanes or into transit ways. And these are like physical direct impediments to the efficiency of transit. And so people will have those experiences and in turn say, well, my only option out is to get into a private automobile, fears which are compounded by things like COVID-19. And so, we know that people want other options. There was recent polling by Data for Progress that shows 79% think that transportation agencies should be required to fix what they have in terms of roads before building any new road capacity. And 61% support an outright moratorium on new road building. And there's also very high demand for higher taxation on the rich and a Green New Deal type public program, as others have talked about on this panel. So positioning this as part of a much broader social transformation is very important. It's not just, ride the bus to your minimum wage, non-unionized, deeply alienating job, but it's a promotion of a much broader liberatory struggle that includes housing and power and healthcare and far more. And on a very pragmatic level, it means taking the opportunities available once this pandemic's over and once we no longer have to social distance and hopefully no longer have to social distance in the ways that we currently do, to actually talk to transit workers and riders and to actually unite our struggles. Just in terms of like the sheer geography of where people gather to catch transit, they're often in, bus shelters, especially in Winnipeg. You go out there in the winter and everyone is congregating in a singular bus shelter. It's very easy to get things like petition signatures or to strike up conversations about how, terrible transit systems are and how much better they need to be. So I think those are the physical places where we can really have a lot of these sorts of conversations. And there's many examples of this happening in practice. Most famously with the LA Bus Riders Union that sued the MTA for discriminatory funding, or the West Harlem Environmental Action that's fought against pollution from bus depots, or TTC riders in Toronto. So there's many, many examples of what it can look like. And I think that's really where the left's response has to be anchored in terms of responding to the right wing's claims that, automobility is the only solution. The responses have to be automobility is undermining every other kind of transit. We know that in terms of ride hailing, there's just been catastrophic impacts where ride hailing has really taken off in terms of people's ability to take transit because ridership declines, and then service cuts come after that because that's how the transit agency has to operate because they don't have sustained revenue or spending power. And so, it means really pushing back at that narrative and really identifying the fact that people's access to automobility undermines every other kind. And it also means acknowledging that, the current system of transit for a lot of people is very, very weak, and they've had very bad experiences on it for a whole host of reasons. And so, we have to be honest about the state that many transit agencies are in, and say that the response is to just greatly, greatly increase investment and also democratic planning power. I won't go too deeply into this at the moment, but a lot of the transit projects that do continue to get built are either privatized, or they are seeking to benefit private profits through things like building into potential tech sectors and these sorts of things, and to like really benefit the more white affluent workers. And that's where transit becomes just part of a broader piece of planning for the neoliberal city, is that the ones that do end up benefiting are those who arguably have access to other options, and the people who are least able to access reliable transportation. So I'm thinking like low wage workers or shift workers, or people who have to catch the bus home at midnight or 1 a.m. or that sort of thing, tend to be left out of those conversations altogether. So this democratic planning really has to happen with the existing riders, the so-called captive riders, which is a very crude concept, but the people who truly do rely on transit, so Black riders, Indigenous riders, people in very poor neighborhoods, and to really collectively envision a society which we're fighting for together, alongside transit workers, alongside existing riders and potential riders, and climate justice groups and all these sorts of things. So it's a very broad conversation, and I don't have a ton of time to go into it now, but just in terms of linking up with anti-policing and anti-carceral organizations, I think that's a very important struggle as well, especially within the context of fair, free transit, is that the people who are policed, the people who are killed on transit as a result of allegedly not having a fare, are overwhelmingly Indigenous and Black people. So I think this really has to become part of, as I've said throughout it, part of a much bigger struggle for liberation, which I think we're seeing pop up in New York, in Chile, in all sorts of places, in Toronto. There's a lot of fare hopping, and watching out for each other, so people will tweet when they see transit cops and these sorts of things. So I think these are very positive visions. I think if we can unite into a broader struggle, really push back against the narrative that the only way out of this is through more private automobility, because that's exactly why we've ended up in the place that we have at the moment, and it's why the state continues to think that it's justified in abandoning transit and leaving people who are most desperately in need of transportation with the least access to. So if people are interested in this, I'd really suggest the book Mobility Justice by Michal, which is also on Verso. It's a really great look at the way that all these transportation crises intersect from the very minor level, or the very like zoomed in level, in terms of people's experiences with disabilities and people's experiences with sexual harassment and assault on transit, all the way up to the very macro level in terms of the impacts of climate change on transportation and the migration situation, all these kind of things. So that'll be kind of the last word. Is I'd also point people to check out the book Mobility Justice as well. Thanks.
Okay, great. So we have about 15 minutes for questions. There are some really great questions in the chat. Thank you guys so much for these really insightful questions. So we won't be able to get to all of them, but I just want to put out there, there's a really great question that I think we should end with, that is asking all the speakers to recommend some literature relevant to socialist planning. I see, Michal, you've put in an extensive list there in the comments, but maybe if all the speakers can just think ahead, and maybe our end question, if you guys can just think of like, one or two books or articles or something that you want to suggest, and then we can end on that one. The other question, I'll just fold a couple of these together. There are a couple of questions about deglobalization. So as the crisis is likely to accelerate deglobalization, such as shorter supply chains and reduced air travel, what is the most effective scale at which to pursue democratic planning? So international, national, regional, or local? Like, is it contradictory in tactics to kind of fight for planning at those various scales, and how can we coordinate that? And then let me fold in one other question that is related. There's a great question about avenues for progress at the local level. So many states have preemptory laws regarding government-sponsored functions, such as banning municipal broadband. And in many localities, economic planning is delegated to proprietary development, and usually through these kind of public-private partnerships, pet project slush funds, things like that. So how do we challenge that model at a local level? So those are kind of two related questions. And just maybe raise your hand, speakers, if you'd like to respond to that, and I can unmute you. Thea. All right.
I'm going to respond to the first one about scales. Does that work now?
All of them.
Oh, all of them? Oh my God. No, I'm going to start with the first one. I'm going to let someone else do it, because if I do all of them, I'll get us to 6:30, which I think is when this event ends. I don't know. Anyways, I'm gonna just speak a little bit about scale, because I think it's such an interesting question. I'm super glad for whoever asked that. When, as I was saying, like at the beginning of this event about how crisis just exacerbates pre-existing dynamics and contradictions, this is one of them, this deglobalization piece. And I think that it's a little hard for us to wrap our head around on the left, because we're so used to responding to, advocates for neoliberal globalization. But now those advocates of neoliberal globalization are like not advocating for that anymore. And so like a few months ago, in pre-COVID days, what feels like a very long time ago, I was conducting interviews at the EU Commission, and I was asking them about their vision for green technology supply chains, like specifically around electric vehicles and lithium batteries. But again, we could apply this to solar panels or wind turbines or whatever, all of these green technologies that are necessary for renewable transition, but the capitalist kind of private sector does not invest in adequately or in the way that we want it to. So, all of these would involve the state, including for reasons Michal brought up earlier in terms of where real innovation comes from. It so often comes from publicly funded research. So anyway, that's just like the context for why I was asking these questions. And all of these very elite policymakers, super neoliberal in their general orientation, were saying, we need these supply chains to be in Europe. Like, we can no longer depend on global supply chains. And especially, and this is where it gets into sort of racist, xenophobic, sort of xenophobic narratives of like, we can't depend on China, is like the very specific way that they would often put it. And now both of those discourses, on the one hand, that supply chains should be less global, that they should be territorialized in different ways. And on the other hand, that China's like dominance of production of X, Y, and Z is the reason that the global economy is so precarious. Both of those arguments we're seeing being parroted a lot right now in terms of medical supply chains, but also in terms of supply chains for food and other essential things. And so, I think that the left needs a way to respond to this. And I'm not going to tell you that it's easy, because I think that there are like conflicting desires that we might have. Like, on the one hand, we might agree that like a totally globally dispersed set of supply chains where like each little phase and node of production is in like totally dispersed territories, we could maybe agree that there are some vulnerabilities of a system like that, right? But what I'm hesitant to say, and what I'm hesitant to embrace, is the idea that like localizing all production is the way forward. And I'm hesitant for a few reasons. One is I think that there are ways in which localism, just in general, while I'm sympathetic to the idea that like democratic control is maybe easier at a local scale. Like, I understand that argument, though I actually think that with technology, it's not clear that local scale is necessary for democratic management. But whatever, this is Michal's wheelhouse, so I'm not going to say too much about it. But I get worried about a few things with localism, or with the desire to just like make the supply chains as sort of as local as possible. One is the way that can exacerbate inequality globally, right? So like we have lots of, the world is deeply unequal. That's like a duh thing to say. But like, if we're just going to like localize production in Europe or in the US, like what does that mean for the global South, right? And what does that mean for equitable access to these technologies? That's one reason I'm worried. And another reason I'm worried, which is one I already kind of mentioned, but I'll just like flesh it out a little bit more, is that the way in which that plays into these sort of elite geopolitical strategies, right? And these sort of like elite strategies for like dominating this supply chain and like, going to trade war with China over that supply chain or whatever. Like I'm wary of the left sort of adopting a framework in which there is competition and scarcity assumed, rather than a framework in which cooperation and equity are assumed, right? And for cooperation and equity, it's not always clear that local is better, though sometimes it might be, right? I think we should be open to like local provisioning where that makes sense. Like I definitely think that as part of like a renewable energy transition, we should have more distributive forms of energy production, not as our only form of energy production, but as one that is certainly in moments of extreme weather. Yes, it makes sense that we have solar panels and wind turbines nearby because maybe the overall grid is shut down because of like a hurricane, right? But it doesn't mean, like, when we don't have hurricanes, like, we should maybe have multi-scalar energy. Like, there's not a zero-sum game between these different scales, I guess is what I'm saying. And we should always think about, prioritizing cooperation, prioritizing equitable access, rather than thinking that a particular scale, like, rather than fetishizing a particular scale. And I guess the other thing that I would say is that there are some things, and I'm thinking of natural resources, and there's a whole question of the natural resources needed for renewable energy transition, and that's what my research centers on right now. And there's a lot of thorny, fraught environmental and ethical questions around that, but it's just a fact that not every place in the world has access to the deposits of lithium, cobalt, nickel, magnesium, rare earths, whatever it is. They're not as rare as you might think you are. They are, like, rare earths are not actually rare. It's a kind of a misnomer, but they're not everywhere, right? So to even produce something like a solar panel, which I think we all agree that, like, we should have production of solar panels and they should be equitably distributed, means that, if we have really localized supply chains, that leaves a lot of places of the world out. So I think we need some forms of cooperation, we need equitable access, and we also need trade. But I think that we need a left vision of what green and socially just trade would look like, rather than leaving trade to, like, the neoliberal economists. We should have our own approach to that. And that's something we talk about in the last chapter of A Planet to Win as well. So I'll leave it there.
Did I just get unmuted? I don't have that much to add. That was great. When I said all of them, I think we we need planning at all of those scales, and all of those scales have have the right place for a given problem, or basically a given problem that we want to solve together. I think those two big issues that we've talked about a lot today, which is the current pandemic, or pandemics in general, global health crises, and climate change, in fact, demand really global some kind of global governance or global democracy from us, because they're totally not localized. And they show in this really visceral way, I think this pandemic is showing that what happens to one of us affects all of us. And again, make space for some of these, socialist principles that we really should be caring for one another. And of course, people have different capacities to respond in different ways to wall themselves off and do various things, both in response to climate change and pandemics. But as we've seen, also, these are not infallible. And I think Thea was right, to bring up the global South. It's crazy that in response to this pandemic, something like vaccines are being spoken of in terms of global competition rather than global cooperation. Like and whether it's the production or the ideas or all of that. So there's lots to talk about there in terms of how you distribute. The very idea of intellectual property is a bit crazy, and something like a pandemic shows it to be. I think the slogan, globalization versus deglobalization, or that is not perhaps the right framing. It's what the slogan in French of the original. In English, it was often called the anti-globalization movement, whereas in French, it was often the altermondialisme, right? Like the different alternative globalization movement. I think that's sort of what Thea alluded to, that it's not a case of stopping trade and stopping, walling ourselves off and leaving levels of development where they are. In fact, especially if we want to respond to the big crises or institute something like a global Green New Deal, we need a lot of technology transfer, institutional transfer, and it goes both ways. There's been a lot of institutional development in the global South that we could learn from, especially in terms of cooperative institutions of governance and things like that. So it's not a one-way thing. Two, it's something that operates at these large scales. And then it depends. If we're talking about transit, obviously, if we're talking about housing, it makes sense to govern those locally. And I think it is important for people to have those levels where they can in some immediate way relate to what they're making decisions over. At the same time, as Thea said as well, we have the technology now to be able to make decisions over and to be able to have participatory processes at these scales that were unimaginable even several decades ago. So I don't. Yeah, I mean, I think it just really depends what problem you're trying to solve, and who. And I think there are difficult questions about who's involved. Like a question, we have a certain amount of a certain resource at a given time. Who decides how we distribute it? If the bicycle, there's a bicycle. This example is stolen from Sam Ginden, but I thought it was good because it's just this very like everyday kind of example. Imagine there's a bicycle factory and it is actually run cooperatively, and you have some several layers of democratic institutions. And the bicycle factory workers want to make bicycles out of titanium or whatever resource it is because they're lighter, better, and just a better bicycle. Who decides whether the titanium goes to the bicycle factory or the hip replacement factory, or whatever these problems are? And I think they're hard questions. I think the market and the price system is not the only way to solve them. In fact, often creates very irrational solutions to these problems. But I think we have to think about all of these things and think about what is the correct scale for solving them, who has input, in what ways, and what makes sense. And and there's lots of sort of value judgment in there, but I think it's hard to say that they could have democracy, that in a thoroughly democratized system, the level of participation and the level of decision making would look very different at these different scales, even if it the amount of participation, even if it looked differently, but the amount of participation and how much we put into them.
I think I've been unmuted. Yeah. I just have a couple of quick comments about the importance of scale. Is that, just very, very basically, like transit systems do not and will not work successfully and most efficiently unless they are planned at many different scales. And so obviously when we think of transits, most often urban transit, so that'll be a specific transit agency and which has a board and it's accountable to the city council, et cetera. But a lot of the transit needs that people have span well beyond that. And so I'm thinking in terms of planning regional, you have commuter trains, you have all sorts of things like that. But then you also have intercity or spanning across the country itself or across the continent. We can scale up to a pretty massive degree depending on how much control we can seize. But if we look at the way that transit has been privatized in Europe and in North America, what this does is it basically fragments systems. And so systems that are otherwise could be planned in order to maximize people's potential to get from one train or one bus to another, and those things are scheduled together and priced together, or hopefully no fares at all. But that there's systems in which you can pay for one ride that transfers to another. All these sorts of things. It has to be done at multiple scales, and we've really seen what happens when that isn't considered in the context of Canada. Greyhound, which was by no means a good or a perfect service, but it provided a service, especially in rural communities in Western Canada. It pulled out of Western Canada over a year ago, and it's just had completely devastating effects in terms of people who need to get from rural towns to big cities for medical appointments, to visit family or friends, to do any number of things. And that also happened at the same time as the Saskatchewan Transportation Company, or the STC, which is a Crown Corp owned by the government of Saskatchewan, sold it off, or they closed it. And what that does is it basically greatly limits the ability for the most, oppressed and exploited people. So whether it's Indigenous peoples who are living in rural areas, or seniors, or people with disabilities, it completely eradicates their ability to get places when they need to. And so I think we really need to be talking about a larger scale when we think of how transit systems interact with each other, both in terms of keeping transit systems public so that we can maximize system coordination, but also in terms of servicing the people who tend to have the least access to transit. I often get criticized for only talking about urban transit systems, but there is such potential for rural transit systems as well, or regional transit systems. I think the problems that those places face are the exact same ones in terms of lack of funding, in terms of lack of supports and democratic planning, as what is faced in the city. So I think that's a really important argument in terms of how to scale up. And the ATU National, which is the transit union in Canada, has put out a call for a national intercity bus system or bus service, which I think is a very powerful demand and something that kind of offers the potential for what our demands may look like in the future. But also just in terms of like where we get our ideas from and how we collaborate struggles internationally. Some of the best transit systems are not in North America, which like probably isn't a surprise to many people. But if we look to China, if we look to Latin America, if we look to many other places, these are the places which have been investing in very good public transit for a very long time, and the results are very clear. And also, Thea's research points to this very strongly, is that in terms of the actual resource implications of the energy transition and the transportation system that we are looking at in the future, we have to be fighting in solidarity with communities on the ground there. And technology does make that a lot easier. It's not to say that those fights are easy, but a lot of the mining companies that are operating in Latin America or operating in Africa are headquartered in North America, and Canada has a massive percentage of mining companies headquartered here. So it's really important that we begin to unite struggles, and not to say that we just like shut down all mining because it's in a place which isn't in Canada or isn't in the US. Thea laid out the reasons for why I don't think that that's a very convincing argument. But in terms of the cooperation, the collaboration, the global solidarity, and the internationalism, these are very long traditions in the left, and we really have to be tapping back into them, because the decisions that we allow capitalists to make in our cities, in our regions, in our countries have direct implications for the indigenous communities, the working class communities in the global south, in terms of the resources that are taken. And we really need to be fighting for very much a multi-scale systems in terms of the transit systems in our own communities and our own countries, but also uniting those struggles around the world, both to get ideas for what our systems could look like, but also because that's a just thing, and it's the leftist thing to do, is to be able to wage those fights together. So yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you. We have so many great questions. I'm so sorry that we're out of time. I just would love for all the panelists to end with, I thought there were a couple of great kind of like optimistic endings that you guys brought up on these questions. So maybe you can all respond with either a response to, will we see the end to capitalism in our lifetime? I always love hearing people's takes on that question. Or maybe just suggest a book or an article on planning for people. So, Michal, do you want to start?
This is a great book on planning that I just picked up because I don't want to answer the hard question that people ask. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's up to us. That's my answer to the first question. Not to be like overly Promethean about it. It's not just up to us, but to a large degree. I mean, I think we can't expect a crisis to solve whether it's this one or another crisis or a coming crisis to solve our problems. I think it's very easy for us to see something worse, but it's also very possible for us to see something better. And it really is up to us to to develop the capacities. Both in terms of what we're talking about today, some of the ideas and the proposals, but also just the capacities to fight for them and make them a reality. And I did put a list of books. They're kind of nerdy, but the kind of economicsy books on planning into the question answer box there.
That was a great list. Thea, you want to go?
Terrible. Am I on? Okay. I'm going to be a rebellious panelist and not actually answer either of those questions, but create the right affect, which is about optimism and feeling like we can do something. And I'm going to recommend a campaign that I thought there'd be a chance to bring up earlier, but a conversation took a different route. So so DSA, which, many people, I know that we have an international audience here, so I'm sorry this doesn't apply to everybody, but folks in the US, if you're involved in DSA, or even if you're not, you could, this could be your point of entry. We have this great new campaign coming out of the Eco-Socialist Working Group of a cancel your bill campaign, and it's sort of about canceling rent, canceling utility bills, and also demanding federal assistance so that individual people don't go into debt over rent or utilities. So it's a really multifaceted campaign that both like addresses immediate needs, but sort of again, in sort of the way that James and Michal have sort of laid out, like has this more emancipatory vision for what collective care and social provisioning might look like. So I'm going to put that in the chat, which is like a sign up thing, like I want to be involved in this, and you get a digital toolkit. And it might be interesting, even if you're somewhere else in the world, because the digital toolkit might be inspiring for like, how might we use digital tools to organize mutual aid, to organize our fellow tenants, workers, neighbors into a set of concrete demands around ending, the payment of rent that is unaffordable, ending utility bills that are unaffordable, and taking a stand that debt is, individual and household debt is totally unsustainable right now. So I'm going to put that out there. And will capitalism end in our lifetimes? If we fight for it, maybe. I think that the neoliberal, again, free trade in quotes, because I don't think it's an accurate term, I think that phase of capitalism strikes me as being over. I think that we're in a different scene right now that in some ways could be worse, because I think that we're seeing elites, capitalists, all over the world engaging increasingly rapacious, extractive, and super exploitative accumulation strategies, because other forms of sort of supposedly normal, but actually was kind of a blip from like the 50s to the 70s, like forms of capitalist growth are like not sustainable anymore. So they're getting worse and more extractive and exploitative with the ways that they're like getting money out of that. And financialization is like a big part of that. So I think capitalism is revealing itself to be the brutal system that it is. Whether, we'll amass enough popular power in the face of that to transform it, I think is an open question, but at least it's a question. Like, I think it's like, not a question that maybe I would have posed, like it's, I've 2 decades on the left. Like, it's not a question that really even seemed like a question a couple decades ago. Like, I, as an individual leftist and Marxist, like wanted that to be the question, but it wasn't like a socially posed question. I think because of the clear ways that the neoliberal order is in crisis, there is an opening, and, it's all about the balance of class forces. So if I can say anything to you, yes, read a book, also join a campaign, in your neighborhood, workplace, community, building, wherever that makes sense for you.
Yeah, that was a great call to action. James, you're up.
Agreed. I'll just start with a couple of recommendations for people to check out other works. This one isn't by a socialist planner, but it's a person I referenced earlier. His name's Paul Mees. So he wrote a book called Transport for Suburbia, Beyond the Automobile Age. And the reason I recommend that is because he really works to sort of myth bust the idea that existing built environments, specifically the suburbs, cannot have quality transit. And this is an argument that gets often deployed to undermine the ability or the campaigns for people to build transit to places like the suburbs. Yes, of course, we need more densified public housing, but oftentimes this is going to take many decades to change the built environments. And there are very successful examples in Europe, even in Calgary, which is where I'm originally from, has really excellent transit, which can get people out of cars and into trains and buses and those sorts of things. So that's one. There's also one called Rights in Transit, Public Transportation, The Right to the City in California's East Bay by Kofi Atoe. And I interviewed him for the book, and he's just excellent. He looks specifically at the history of transit rider struggles in the Bay Area and some of the challenges and the successes and that sort of thing over time. So I'd really recommend people checking that out. And finally, I would say there's a book called Stolen City by Owen Taves, and it's specific to the history of Winnipeg and Manitoba, which is where I live now. But it's a very, very, I think, important book in terms of how it's written as a history of racial capitalism. It really frames not only the formation of dominant blocks by capitalist powers, but the very consistent pushbacks and fightbacks by indigenous peoples and by working class communities. So I think as a working class history, it's very important, and it just kind of gives some additional insights into the specific crises that we're facing in Canada. Especially in terms of like indigenous self-determination and all that kind of thing. So those are the three I would recommend. And then in terms of whether capitalism will end in our lifetimes, I feel like that was well answered by other panelists. But I think we just really need to look at what's happening in other countries or look beyond North America. Like there's, of course, very exciting things happening here in terms of organizing, rent strikes and, against police violence and all these sorts of things. But there are many, many countries in the global South that have been fighting against capitalism and neoliberalism and imperialism and all the rest for a very long time. And these are stories that we often don't hear about just because of the nature of corporate media and that sort of thing. But I think, if we really look to those as examples and remind ourselves that these struggles have been happening for a very long time. And, whether we'll see capitalism in 5, 10, 15 years, I don't really think that's necessarily the point. Like, we have to fight, we have to do it. And so I think all we can do is continue to fight. And that in turn will open up new possibilities that we may not be able to see at this point. We can't really decide or determine how our actions today are going to impact the future. Of course, we can strategize, and we must strategize, especially what I was talking about before in terms of internationalism and global solidarity. We have to do that, but it's not a do X and get Y or Z. I'm not a math person, but it's not a to B sort of situation. And I think we just really need to fight in the places that we can intelligently, really dialectically, like thinking about the relationship in each of our local and regional context, but also really what we were talking about before about scaling up. And that's what we can do. That's what we have to do. So I think that's exciting. There's powerful demands. There's powerful examples of this happening around the world. And I think we just have to keep watching that and keep working where we can.
Great. That's a wonderful note to end on. I want to thank all of our brilliant speakers. Please check out their books. Please buy them from the publishers or from Bookshop. We really appreciate your support. Check out Verso's 50% off sale. And thank you all so much for coming. And thank you so much for your great questions and comments and campaign sharing in the chat. This was a really wonderful panel. So take care. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.